So the title of this conference, Hidden in Plain Sight, this is a theme that we're going to be working with here. And my work is around talking about things economic, welding them to things that are non-economic as well. And so what I want to start with is an awareness test, all right? And what we're going to do in this awareness test is see if you can do better than, about 80% of the people get this awareness test wrong, all right? And here's the test. The test is I'm going to show you a really, really short video. It's just, a number of seconds long. And what we've got in there is we've got two teams of people. One team is wearing white shirts, one team is wearing black shirts. The people who are wearing the white shirts and black shirts are all passing basketballs. I want you to count, if you can, the number of times the people in white pass the basketball to each other. So only complete passes count. Bounce passes count, throw passes, all of that, but if they drop the pass, it doesn't count. So the key is to see if you can come up with the number of times that they actually catch the ball. So that's the instructions. Just how many times the players wearing white pass the basketball and catch it.
Might have to do this.
I'll have to do it from there.
0.
Ready, and go. Nope. Okay, what do you get? 16, 14, 14, 15. 15. The correct answer is gorilla.
Yeah.
How many people saw the gorilla? Put your hands up, hold them up. Everybody else look around. Hold on a second. Why don't we watch this again, but this time see if you can, just tune your eyes slightly differently. This is the exact same video, no trickery. It's very subtle. That's the one. So what happened? It's hidden in plain sight. And what happened there was very simple to understand. We were given a set of instructions. We were all trained to operate with sets of instructions. We look at what we're being told to look at. I will submit to you that there are a lot of things that the equivalent of this gorilla. We're going to be discussing this gorilla throughout the theme of this conference. And I would submit to you that seeing the Dow at all-time new highs is a form of a gorilla. There are a lot of things happening in our markets right now that we really ought to be paying attention to that most people don't seem to be seeing. And that's really where a lot of the value comes in, is knowing how to see what other people aren't seeing, even when it's fully actually in plain sight. So that was just an awareness test, just a little something to get this opening, and we'll continue that theme as we go.
Here's a few charts I put together on just, how many people think that we've actually gone through any kind of deleveraging cycle. And if you look at it in certain ways, if you look at loans and leases, pretty much flat. But if you look at what's happened to total credit market debt, we're almost up to $60 trillion in total credit market debt. And down here we see the expansion. This is what's happened to base money. It's gone from less than $500 billion to almost $4 trillion. But to support the economy, look at, does that represent deleveraging to anyone? It certainly doesn't to me. Here's a chart of the same thing, total credit market debt versus GDP. This is how much credit market debt it takes to get this rise in GDP that we've seen here. Now, here's a chart of M2 versus base money. And base money here, we can see on this point of view, has exploded. The balance sheet of the Fed is still growing. They've tapered, they've cut their tapering, they've cut their asset purchases in half. This is still going wild. But if we say, okay, what has M2 done? What has M2 done? If we subtract what the Fed has done, this isn't going anywhere, yet M2 is rising. In percentage terms, if we subtract the amount of printing the Fed has done from M2 on a percentage annualized growth, we're down to almost negative 5% growth on M2. So the Fed is still very much active in this market. And you know, everyone's under the perception, the belief that the Fed's going to do all of this tapering and start hiking interest rates. I had a chart yesterday. It didn't look like it got added into here, but interest on the national debt is about a little bit over $400 billion. And I did some projections a couple of months ago, just using, I don't believe their numbers, but I used the Office of the Management budget numbers. And at 4% by the year 2020, interest on the national debt is going to consume $1 trillion a year. That's if you believe the growth projections that they come up with. And Chris and I'm sure most of the people in this room don't believe those projections. And this is a chart of TMS2, which is total money supply. This is an Austrian version. It's essentially all the money that's available on demand. And part of that is savings deposits. And there's a debate in the Austrian camp whether savings is money that's really available on demand. Is that a credit instrument, or is it a saving instrument? If you look at it technically, a savings account is really a lending account. You deposit money into a bank, and for the express purpose, they pay you interest on it. The bank can lend it out. But from a practical standpoint, which is what some of the Austrians say, and I've wavered back and forth on this, from a practical standpoint, you can go into the bank tomorrow and pull every cent out of your savings account. So if we look at base money supply, it's about $4 trillion, and if we look at all of the money that's available on demand, these are all the various components that I added up together to produce this, we're 10 million. So if people went to get all the money that was available on demand, they're $6 trillion short. The money isn't there at all. So and certainly if you compare that to the total credit that's out there, which is at 60 trillion, is the Fed really going to be tapering? Are they really going to be hiking like everyone assumes they are? And so this gets into a discussion of what's the end game? You know, what has the Fed done here other than manage to build another bubble in the bond market, build a bubble in the stock market, build a bubble in the equity market? Meanwhile, housing's slowing, and I've got a whole number of charts tomorrow where we can talk about housing. So there's a lot of assumptions in here, a lot of these beliefs about where things are going. And we're going to see a movie in just a little bit. But the question is, where should we be going? What should we be doing? I'm in the camp that says that this is fraud. We have base money supply of 4 trillion, and we've got 10 trillion that people can go out and take. So in effect, the money isn't there. If I had a grain elevator and I had 5 tons of grain in the elevator and I lent out 50 tons of grain, I would be arrested for fraud. If I sold watches and sold 3 watches and only had 1 of them, and the people thought that the watches were there and I was just storing them for them, I would also be convicted of fraud. Yet we do this exact same thing every day. And people think that the money in their checking account is there when it's really not there. It's just an illusion. And so how do we end the fraud? I think we need to get rid of fractional reserve lending. And some people have said that, well, if we do that, there's no money. But it comes down to a whole discussion of how do we end the Fed? How do we end the central banks? How do we get to a sound money supply? Do we get to a sound money supply? There's books written on the end game, and I don't think any of us knows what the end game is. I think it's highly likely that a currency crisis is coming. Does it start in the United States? Does it start in Japan? Does it start in Europe? Does it start in China? A lot of people, there's a lot of talk about hyperinflation here in the United States. I don't see that, yet I do see a currency crisis coming. And Chris and I will just sit back and talk about that. And if you've got any questions on this subject, just ask away.
So I can feel the tension in the room. The correct answer was 15. For anybody, so you can put that to rest. Can you go back to the first slide, which showed credit market debt? So what's intriguing to me is my critique and analysis of the whole thing widens back and doesn't really say whether pro or con, is this a good money system or a bad money system. But if we did a curve fit on that blue line, we'd discover that that's an exponential system. Our credit system's been growing exponentially for a really long time. And this chart starts in 1950. I've run the series from 1965 or so, probably about there. And it fits with a 0.99 coefficient. It's very, very tight fit, and it's compounding at 8% a year. And that's the system we have. Whether you say that's a good thing or a bad thing, the whole system is designed to compound at about 8% per year. And that has some features associated with it. But see that little wiggle that starts in 2008? That's what almost brought the whole system down. It's a robust system in some ways, but that little wiggle taught me that it's also a fragile system in other ways. And so my main critique of all this is that, and you'll see some of my slides on this tomorrow, is that fundamentally it's not possible to exponentially increase your claims, which is what debt is, on a world that's finite. I think we're in that awkward period now where we're starting to find out that there are limits to how much debt you can cram into a finite system and the pace at which you can do it. And certainly one thing I would suggest is an easy claim to make is that we just can't grow it at the same rate we used to. So maybe it's half the rate. But that changes a lot, and that's really what I'm seeing in this story is the world trying to figure out how to negotiate a world that's already stuffed with debt. And all the Federal Reserve knew how to do was to freak out and just give us more of that debt. By any means necessary, every trick in the book.
And the worst part about it is the central banks globally are trying to introduce, they want inflation. Europe is very concerned, oh my God, heaven forbid should prices fall. What does the average person need? The average person actually would love the price of gasoline to fall, the price of food to fall, the price of education. Well, in Europe it might be free, but it's certainly not here in the United States. So people want and need these prices to come down, but central bankers are hell-bent on producing inflation. It doesn't work if you just interest on national debt. If we just had a mere 4% interest rate here, the average rate now, by the way, is what do you call it? A blended rate is something like 2.4% that the U.S. is paying on its debt. At 4% by 2020. With the expected growth, which I don't think is going to come in, we're at $1 trillion a year in tax money just to pay interest on the debt. Mathematically, this doesn't work. And the whole thing about this inflation debate is so nonsensical because it's all based on a lie that says we need to have inflation if we need to have inflation to have growth. And I don't think, and it's also based on the lie that people will hold off buying things if prices are falling. Well, the only things that they'll hold off buying when prices are falling are the prices of assets, the prices of bonds, houses, stocks. People don't like them. People like stocks when they'd rather pay a 70 PE than a 10 PE. They'd rather be buying. But if I'm going to buy a computer, if computers are getting cheaper, faster, better every year, and when my computer wears out, I buy another computer. If there's more features on a computer, I buy it. If someone needs a coat, they're going to go buy a coat. But if someone needs a car and car prices are going up 10–20% a year, maybe they try and get an extra year or two out of their car. So I think the central bankers have it ass backwards. And you have to wonder, are they really that dense, or are they purposely lying? You know, because the problem is with deflation is not that costs are going down, productivity rising and costs falling is actually the natural state of affairs. Central bankers come by and they said, oh, we want inflation to go up. Mathematically, it doesn't work because wages aren't keeping up, Chris.
Well, this is, when you say the central banks are looking for inflation, I know they tell us they're looking at prices, but they can't actually just be tracking prices, right? Because let me be clear, central bankers, in my view, could care less if my tuition costs for my upcoming children double in the next 5 years. That's totally immaterial and irrelevant to them, and they don't care if my car costs more. The bankers, as far as I understand it, they need inflation in the system, meaning they need more money and credit in the system. That's what the banking system needs, as far as I understand it. So I think central bankers are trying to, in my view, they're just trying to solve for keeping the banking system healthy. Way downstream, there potentially you could see something called general price inflation, which might be a marker that this is all healthy and expanding like it's supposed to. But you know, a lot of the so-called inflation we're seeing, rising prices, comes to us as a feed-through effect of oil, which now has a marginal cost of finding a new barrel of a minimum of 80, but probably closer to 90 to 100, depending on the field, and that's driven the price of oil up. That's a supply issue. That's not a true inflation issue, by which I mean the price of everything could go up a lot because the price of oil is rising, and that still doesn't solve anything in terms of keeping the banking system healthy and solvent, because their assets can be fed through and paid out of existing new loans and existing and new loans doing in that big cycle.
It's all about pumping enough money to enable the number of loans that are out there to be paid back. And that's not what they're saying, but that's what they're doing. And they go out there and they talk about inflation. Actually, one of the few things that the Fed, you never hear the Fed talk about money supply. When is the last time the Fed has mentioned money supply? Probably back to 1980 or something. So they get together, they talk about capacity production, they get together, capacity utilization, and they talk about all these esoteric things. The one thing they never talk about is the one thing they ought to be talking about, you know, what's going on with money supply, and how are we going to live in this 8% exponential world of paying back all of this debt when real wages, and I've got a chart tomorrow that shows this, real wages are back at median real wages are back at a level 1969, Chris.
Well, this chart to me explains everything in this whole story, because if we plotted GDP under that, nominal or real doesn't matter, it's less than the rate of growth in credit market debt. And so the system we've gotten addicted to is roughly twice as much expansion in credit market debt as real GDP growth. So that gets a little fuzzy when we look at the whole story, but I know that I personally cannot expand my debt at twice the rate that I'm getting raises in my income level. If that doesn't work for me as an individual, it won't work for the both of us because we're sitting near each other, it won't work for this whole room. It means it doesn't work for a whole nation either. And this isn't just a US story, we're picking on US story, but you look at the OECD debt to GDP ratios, we're like 350%, that's just debt. That doesn't include off-balance sheet items, no liabilities are wrapped into that. You put those in, pick a country, you're between 500 and 1,000% in terms of liabilities to underlying income. And that's the long and the short of it. And you're right, that's the conversation they never had, which was 2008 was a great time to go, oops, I guess we shouldn't have been increasing our debts at twice the rate of our income. Maybe that wasn't such a good idea. Let's figure out how we're gonna manage that period of time of living more closely within our means. Instead, I feel like they've gone pedal to the metal, ignore that reality, let's just get credit growth going because it's an emergency. The temporary measures are now 5 years, going on 6 years in temporariness, and they feel permanent at this point in time.
And all we've done is made things worse. Any questions or comments?
So I have a question, and I know what the answer is supposed to be, but do you think the interest rates could be kept at zero for another almost indefinite period of time, five more years? And was the betting against it? A lot of people have lost money betting against that.
Oh, the question was, do you think the Fed can keep interest rates at 0% for another 5 years?
Well, Japan says they can, and there's really no technical reason they can't. You know, I get in these debates all the time. People say the Fed has done too much with its balance sheet; it's gone as far as it can. And my snappy rejoinder is, well, why can't they take it to 40 trillion? The only thing that's preventing any central bank from doing whatever they want to do is the other central banks doing some enforcement mechanisms. And I've seen a lot of very tight coupling between the policies of the Bank of Japan, Bank of England, ECB, and the United States Federal Reserve. So technically the answer is sure. But I think what we're going to be facing is that there'll be some breaking point in that larger relationship. Sooner or later, somebody's going to have to blink in that story, I think. Because otherwise, if the central banks all agree to buy each other's debt and just keep that chain going, I don't see an enforcement mechanism that exists, not in the rule sets as I understand them.
What's the scenario that might cause someone to blink? Who would blink? Certainly not Europe would blink. Japan would blink. They're all on the same side of the argument.
Well, so who might blink? I'm tracking the Ukraine situation very closely because, let's be clear, the United States is leading a form of economic warfare against certain people and groups in Russia at this point in time, and they're dialing it up. At some point, if that goes further, I could see a situation where Russia manages to drive a wedge by going to Germany and saying, listen, about that gas that you're getting from us, how would you like to keep that? The United States is pretending we have a united front against Russia at this point in time, but Russia's got China on its side. And the thing that's lurking under the background of that story that I feel could be a moment, I mean, who knows, but this event has all of my attention because Russia only has about 7 trillion cubic feet of natural gas to export in any given year. Last year, they signed a deal with China that's going to be taking 30% of that to China that wasn't going to China previously. Europe has no plan B for where it's going to get its natural gas from. So it's a very, energy is the piece of, that's the subtext to that story. So if we get down to it at that point in time, if the United States absolutely insists that Europe follows along with our line, and Europe says we can't because, you know, it's nice and all, we like you, but we need this gas more than we need political support across the pond. So I don't know. There's a lot of events like that I could see driving a wedge, but for now I don't see anything that shows institutional or geopolitical distrust at the level necessary to create that wedge.
There really is no past history that shows us in this kind of global pickle. So, you know, we know that it's all messed up. We know it's been going on for a long time, but it's just absolutely an unknown territory, isn't it? In terms of how it gets undone. Does it go for 20 years? Does it go for 5 years? And what happens, you know, when it starts to fall apart? Well,
the biggest bubble here is faith. We've got unbelievable amount of faith in central banks that they can keep all these balls levitated. I don't believe they can, yet at the same hand, I've got to admit that they've kept these balls in the air a lot longer than I thought they would. I never would have thought that the S&P would be flirting with the levels that we had. I had that as like a 10% scenario back in 2010 for how high that the market could get. Yet here we are, and people are talking about the market doubling again, just like they talked about the Dow doubling in 2000. But at some point, things matter. The question is, what point? What point does valuation matter? What point does sentiment change? The housing market in 2005 dropped dead cold in sentiment. It was amazing. It was like lights out. People went in places in Florida from standing outside in a line overnight hoping to buy a lottery ticket for the right to buy a condo to 1 month later the lines were completely gone and the condo market crashed. That was the beginning of the housing bust. So sentiment changed overnight, and there was no catalyst for it that I could see. It just changed. And so sentiment eventually dies of exhaustion, if nothing else. And we might be seeing some hints of that right now.
Well, that's the best part about bubbles, is that they just end because it's like somebody blew a silent whistle that only dogs and buyers could hear. You know, and you can't really, and then later we go, oh, it must have been that moment. But really, they were out of step badly, and so they were looking for a reason. And so when you make the observation that this is uncharted territory, absolutely, keep a journal. This has never been tried before. And the thing that really gets me, if you look at who's sitting on the FOMC, right? So there's a number of appointed governors and then some other ones, but you look at the appointed governors on the FOMC panel, you've got Yellen, and formerly Jeremy Stein, who needs to be replaced, right? Both academics. They bless their hearts, but they're PhDs. They work in ivory tower institutions, and then 3 other people with 2 empty spots for the 7 appointed positions. And of the 3 other people, all of them have jurisprudence degrees. They're all lawyers. All of them were on the right committees. All of them came up through various administrations and ended up getting these plum assignments. You will notice that there's no geographical representation, there's no industrial representation, and there's nobody on there that has any experience conducting massive sociological experiments, which is what you're doing when you inflate a country's money supply. It's an experiment that's sociological, and that's why we can't know why things end. It's not a function of economics, and it's why we started with this psychological gorilla experiment, because really that's what we're talking about. This market, as we're looking at it, and everything the Fed is doing, has never been tried before. People ought to have a little latitude that it might not work out exactly as planned.
Just a couple of impressions. When you look at the accumulation of debt obligations, including corporate debt, when you look at equity market cap, we now have the highest enterprise value, median enterprise value, to revenues that we've ever seen, including 2000, across major stocks. So part of what strikes me about this is when we say that these credit market instruments and market capitalization has grown at a rate that exceeds the growth rate of the economy. Really, part of what's going on is that the deliverable cash flows against these instruments has dropped, and so it actually it supports what we see from a valuation side, that the returns on these instruments are likely to be extraordinarily low going forward for a long period of time, because you can't generate the cash flows to to support higher rates of return. At the same time, that's actually what the Fed's really engineered. You created a zero interest rate environment where people reach for yield, and so they're accepting right now this vast increase in covenant light lending, this vast increase in leveraged loans to already highly indebted borrowers, which is now higher than it was in 2007. And when you look at all these aggregate financial claims versus reserves, Mish, what you were saying, I think I look at it a little differently, not so much as fraud, but increasing fragility, in the sense that you can build that little house of cards for quite a while, but as you build it higher and higher, you become more susceptible to small changes. And so then the question, what makes, for instance, central banks blink? What makes buyers blink? Buyers are now accepting the lowest risk premiums in history. If we get any, if central banks are going to continue to do this, it's predicated on the assumption that economic growth doesn't accelerate for a long period of time, like Japan. And so there's a little bit of a mismatch, it seems to me, between the long-term expectations that investors have that they're actually going to get a return on this stuff, with the reality of what has to happen in order to keep the status quo the same, which is that these cash flows don't grow. And so it's that sort of tension between the cash flows that you can deliver and the amount of liabilities that we're creating that seems to me to be a little bit dangerous. I'd like to get your thoughts on that, and then JJ is looking at his watch.
So that yield compression that we're seeing across everything, and it's caused people to chase yield and also chase risk. Yeah, eventually the mantra has got to be that people are scurrying for all the ways they can get return on, and when it breaks, they're going to be worried about return of principal. We'll get to that whole moment again. But ultimately, like this whole dynamic here, when I'm looking at PEs of 80, say on the Russell 2000, or I'm looking at junk bonds with a 5 handle, or I'm looking at Italian yield 10-year debt hitting all-time lows, all-time, right? Those are all measures to me that say that Anybody who's buying that stuff right now, it has one of two explicit, if not implicit, backings and understandings under that. One is that the future is going to be a lot bigger than the present. The only way you can pay back $60 trillion or collectively $100 trillion of sovereign debt that exists out there right now is if the future grows into that. Right? Everybody they don't want just the interest on that, they want their principal back at some point. So A, you've got that. B, a high PE ratio in a stock or a highest median enterprise value to revenues, however you want to measure that. Those are just explicit bets that a lot of growth is coming. And we're about, what, 12 years into a low growth environment at this point in time, and there's nothing to say we're accelerating towards one at this point in time, except for that mythical second half recovery, which turns into the third half recovery that everybody waits for. And so I do think that there's, expectations are really high. So the second implicit, explicit understanding is people just must be going on the idea that the Fed's got my back. They'll bail me out of this, the Fed's got it.